I used to start all my shows with In the Grim Darkness of the 21st Century, which was a joke made for me by Gene Bajelon on Warhammer 40k and the mood that you normally get from some Varn blog posts, which is not total doomerism. I'm not actually a doomer. I do believe in the resilience of human communities, probably a lot more than other leftists in some ways. But I also think a lot of what we're dealing with right now is ideological coping mechanisms. Nonetheless, I've seen this tendency to try to portray parts of the paleo conservative right as isolationist. And I wanted to pick up on Tim Barker's piece from July of this year about that, because I think Tim has a point. So we'll get into it. And I might sound a little bit more doomery than normal as I talk about this, because I don't have a lot of prospects for peace anywhere. Stop saying isolationist. It's misleading, invidious, and obscures what's actually bad and scary about right-wing nationalist foreign policy. At one point in Joseph Heller's Good as Gold, the main character demands of one of his frenemies, "Don't words mean anything to you?" This is how I feel when I hear or read people talk about isolationism. Brett Stevens is one of the dumbest of countless pundits making objectively false statements such as, quote, "It's J.D. Vance's isolationist instincts that stand out the most and worry me the most. Vance really is one of those Republicans who think that practically the only foreign policy we need is a secure, militarized southern border." What kind of way is it to talk about someone who wants to bring to the Ukraine war to a rapid close so America can focus on the real issue, which is China, asterisk, which is also John Mearsheimer's perspective, for much as I respect Mearsheimer's blatantly almost ghoulish honesty about some things. He actively wants war with China, as opposed to someone like Peter Zion, who tacitly wants war with China. I mean, pick your foreign policy realists. Do you want who are they siding against and why? It's usually all bad. Nonetheless, let's continue. Someone who, quote, wants to empower the president of the United States, whether that's a Democrat or a Republican, to use the power of the U.S. military to go after drug cartels. Someone who says we need to do something with Iran, not those weak little bombing runs. We need to punch the Iranians. We need to punch them hard. And that's what Trump did when he took out Soleimani. Notice the thing with picking up the neoconservatives' favorite place it would like to but can't turn into a bomb pit cushion, Iran, has been picked up by the Trumpists, and I've seen a lot of people who ignore this, as if the peace-nicking on Ukraine, Russia, where I am not entirely unsympathetic to some of Trump's positions, even if I'm also pretty much in a place where I do think that the whole war should have been avoided in the first place, and that it is probably a crime that it happened on the part of both Russia and the United States. Nonetheless, it seems to me that the complications with Iran mess up any foray one would have there, because Iran is a Russian ally. And so unless you can blink Russia away from all its traditional allegiances since 1992, it's going to be hard for me to see how this would not cause issues there as well. Nonetheless, people seem to be ignoring that. Okay. Who says it is of the utmost importance that the United States stands with our allies in Israel? I mean, that's a bipartisan consensus there, despite popular opinion being against it. Some people realize that this is weird, so they say quasi-isolationist, but what does that even mean? Not only our language suffers, people shamelessly say false things about history. Here's Time magazine. Trump's intention to remake America's relations abroad may just be as consequential. Since its founding, the U.S. has sought to build and sustain alliances based on shared values of political and economic freedoms. The second sentence is just not true. Yeah, it isn't true. I'm going to agree with Tim there. And it is not, and that's not a partisan judgment. People who launch the U.S. on its post-1945 path will also have told you without hesitation that they were doing something new. The disregard for truth and language is corrosive, affecting other words as well. His political. Vance is political. Vance is an avowed isolationist. Leave aside the I word itself for a second. What does avowed mean? Vance's avowed position is this: no, I don't think that we should pull out of NATO, and no, I don't think that we should abandon Europe. Is he lying? Very possibly. This is a man who believes in almost nothing, who switched from never Trump to Trump forever because elites made fun of Ron Howard's adaptation of his best-selling memoir. But he's not an avowed isolationist. Is anyone an avowed isolationist? Yeah, that's a good question. If anyone claimed the label, you might expect it to be Colonel Robert E. Wood, a visionary Midwestern retailer, the driving force behind the American First, an anti-Semite, and an all-around nasty piece of work. But Wood said, to the best of my knowledge, there has never been a real isolationist. One corresponding to the definition of an isolationist is attributed to that word by the Easterners. It is literally true that no one ever called themselves an isolationist. Yeah, in fact, it's almost always been a slur by a liberal consensus against people who were not part of that consensus, but often makes their politics more cleaned up than it initially appears. But historians have overwhelmingly agreed with Colonel Wood that the term is misleading at best. It's almost always used as a pejorative, which makes it more emotive. I disapprove of this person's foreign policy rather than analytical. Proponents of specific foreign policy interventions were being polemical and obviously not accurate when they said that isolationists would compel us to confine all activities of our people within our own frontiers. To quote the influential internationalist, or globalist, and not a word that I like, but here, Cordell Hull. As historian Brooke Blower has written, the idea of isolationism cannot even survive a brief contact with the real people it supposedly describes. Herbert Hoover, after all, was a world-renowned humanitarian who lived and traveled abroad extensively, spoke some Mandarin, supported the League of Nations, spearheaded numerous relief campaigns from Belgium to Soviet Russia. Charles Lindbergh was an adventurous aviator who shrunk the distance between New York and Paris and helped the Pan American Airways stretch its routes across the oceans. More likely, you, like me, abhor the foreign policy visions of isolationists like Woods, Hoover, and Lindbergh. Yeah, but I also abhor the foreign policy visions of Harris, Blinken, and Biden. But, whatever. But even if you think they deserve to be stuck with the pejorative label, this is just misleading. It obscures the fact that isolationists had, and to an extent they still have, their own vision of a global order. And here again, Colonel Wood of America First, the old one. Our true mission is North America and South America. With our resources and ability, we can develop a virgin continent like South America. The reorganization and proper development of Mexico alone would afford an outlet for our capital and energies for some time to come. You see, I always used to wonder why the people who wanted to colonize Latin America were aligned with the people who wanted decolonization in the Philippines and were worried about forays in Europe. They were often the same former and ex-Confederates and their ideological descendants going down to McKinley, opposing the imperial ambitions of an equally ghoulish person, Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt's policy in the Philippines is something that should not ever be ignored. But nonetheless, it's interesting to me that people ignore that there is actually a rational connection here. The Monroe Doctrine is isolationist within our sphere of influence, which should be, according to the people who promote it, all of the Americas. And you can see that in certain kinds of right-wing multipolarity thinking. We'll cede other grounds and not be the global policeman, which honestly, I don't think we should be either. It's just a hegemony of property anyway. But what we do see a lot of the time is something that's just as imperialistic, just aimed at brown people. Wood served on the board of the United Fruit. Nobody's idea of an anti-individualist outfit. Yeah, no, not at all. People know where Banana Republic comes from. Long before most American businesses thought about the rest of the world at all, Wood led Sears in Cuba and Mexico, and this vision of international relations gave rise to its own foreign policy. For example, when Wood said in 1940, no government in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, South American countries will be tolerated unless it is friendly to the United States. We are prepared to use force to attain that objective. That's from an American firster. Thus, the isolationist label actually makes it impossible to understand the precise dangers of certain kinds of right-wing foreign policy. The scariest thing about someone like Robert Taft was not his reluctance to go to war, but the fact that once he supported a war, he was willing to consider extreme forms of intervention. Taft made a bit of a fuss over the lack of congressional authorization for the Korean War, but he soon became more frustrated with the fact the war was stalemated, a situation he likened to a football game in which our team reaches the 40-yard line and is already instructed to kick. Our team can never score. Taft wanted to score, and to do so he was willing to countenance major escalation. Quote, using Chiang Kai-shek's troops in Korea or South China, the bombing of Chinese communications, perhaps imposing a blockade on Chinese mainland, dismissing any hesitation about the possibility that the Russians may come into the war. This whole peacenik turned warhawk thing is not new in the right-wing sphere at all. People like Taft especially like nuclear air power, which they saw as an economical, capital-intensive, private sector-friendly alternative to standing armies. Ah, yes, the beginnings of the military-industrial complex, which you thought these isolationists, quote-unquote, opposed. Quote, the ability of our Air Force to deliver atomic bombs on Russia should never be open to question, said the nation's leading isolationist, unquote. At one point, I always think of Phyllis Schlafly, the most famous anti-feminist, but a committed Taft factionalist, whose most successful book had a whole chapter on how the big international New York banks rigged the Republican convention for Eisenhower in 1952. Common conspiracy among Birchers. There, she is trying to untangle her visions on the Korean War 60 years after the fact. Depew, what's your position on the Korean War? Schlafly, well, my position is we should win it. I think with hindsight now, it's too bad that we didn't win it. Depew, when it first broke out in June of 1950, do you think we got into the war in the right way? Schlafly, no. Truman got us into the war without a declaration of war by Congress, which the Constitution calls for. Depew, would you have been in favor of supporting the war had it been taken to Congress and gotten a declaration of war? Probably not. Depew, but in 1952, of course, all of this was fait accompli. It's already behind you. Your position in 1952 was to win the war? Yes. To win the war, yes. We were already in it. Depew, some things that I have read in terms of what you have advocating in 1952 during the campaign were a blockade against China, bombing the bridges over the Yellow River, which, of course, the way the Chinese were getting their reinforcements and their supplies in, and basically an escalation of war. If you settle for nothing but victory, then you're talking about pushing the line all the way up, basically to the invasion of North Korea again. Does that sound right? Schlafly, well, it's just as MacArthur said. There's no substitute for victory. We're in the war. Let's win it or get out. Depew, the fear at times was that if we pushed that hard, we might trigger a much larger war at the worldwide level. Schlafly, well, I go with MacArthur's wisdom rather than Truman's. Now, that's a long quote, and I've actually edited out many of the more rounds of back and forth. I think the exchange perfectly illustrates the frequent incoherence of right-wing versions of foreign policy restraint, or limits on constitutionalism. And more importantly, the fact that the contradiction is usually resolved in favor of massive violence. In the case of Schlafly, would have allowed MacArthur to start a global, probably nuclear war with China in order to win a smaller war, which Schlafly didn't even initially support. See the same inclination towards knock out and blow with Trump and Vance. Finish the job, punch them hard. This is why the whole Trump as an anti-imperialist is such a laughable thing for me when I hear it. It's not that the Democrats are any better. They're not. But quit gaslighting yourself into thinking there's a popular alternative. What's the alternative? There's no perfect term substitute for isolationism. Many of my intellectual heroes, Bruce Cummings and Mike Davis, I think a good fault is nationalism. People on both sides in 1948 would have understood the term and accepted it as value neutral. For example, Michigan's author Vandenberg described the contest between Eastern Internationalist school of thought and the Midwestern Nationalist school of thought. And at the same time, Vandenberg identified himself with nationalism, though this would famously change. But to me, that ideological stitch shows the utility of the term. Vandenberg called himself a nationalist when he was a nationalist and an internationalist when he was an internationalist. And of course, there are many different internationalisms. I think we should really talk about the differences in international vision instead of always talking about globalism as if nationalism is always the answer to that. But we see that even on the left today, as if autarkic economies were even possible now. All right, anyway, back to the piece. Of course, there's no real reason we should necessarily refer to the categories used by historical actors, but nationalists would also fit well with the way we use language today. The word connects via economic nationalism to the protectionist impulses common to Taft, Robert E. Woods, Pat Buchanan, and James David Vance. No one has ever imagined that nationalism was inconsistent with expansionism, so the concept allows for so-called isolationists to have a foreign policy, indeed a militaristic vision of their own. Just keep that in mind given what Trump and Vance have said about Mexico or about Palestine and Israel. I don't say this to say that there's no such thing as right-wing peaceniks. Believe me, I used to be one. But one of the things I realized is there was no such thing as isolationism. It was which part of the empire were you favoring? And were you willing to share any of that with other of the capitalist powers? And on this, I think Tim Barker has a pretty good historical point that applies now. Don't get fooled by this shit. Don't get fooled by the Democrats either. They've never been a peace party. Do not lie to yourself. The party of Scoop Jackson didn't all of a sudden forget its Scoop Jacksonness. And for those of people who think I'm soft on the Democrats, I think the war problems that we have are largely their fault. But so many people want us to default and like side with other people because of the threat of nuclear war, as if the threat of nuclear war goes away with carpet bombing Iran. Come the fuck on. Anyway, like and subscribe, hit the bell, protect your peace. There's a Patreon. You can find more where I talk more about this shit behind the Patreon wall. Although I admit the discourse there has been a little bit more doomer lately. I don't know how many polycrises you need this October when I'm recording this. This will come out later than October, but whatever. Who knows if any of it will matter by that time. But hell, I'm not redoing it. Take care. Protect your peace.